basically turned into a hermit for about a good 8 months. The only person I would see outside of my family was my pastor's wife.
Candace is saying that Erika went missing in 2008 for about 6 to 8 months, where she kind of just like was a recluse, and that's usually when somebody gets pregnant and they go and quietly have a kid.
8 months. That's how long she was gone. No posts, no appearances, no trace, just silence. And now people online asking a question that's getting louder by the day. What exactly happened during that missing window in Erika Kirk's life? Because here's where it gets strange. Years later, footage resurfaces. A rally, a crowd. And standing right next to Erika, a child no one can fully explain. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's one of those details that doesn't make sense until you start connecting everything else. Now, before we go any further, this video is based on publicly discussed information, online theories, and claims that have not been independently confirmed. But when timelines don't add up, people start looking closer. So the real question is, was that 8-month disappearance just a break from the world, or something much bigger that nobody was supposed to notice? What makes this situation even more intriguing is not just the missing timeline, it's the pattern around it. Because when you step back and look at Erika Kirk's story the way online observers have been piecing it together, it doesn't start in 2008. It builds toward it. At least, that's what many people across forums and independent commentary spaces have been suggesting. Now, to be clear, everything you're about to hear is based on publicly discussed information, archived clips, and online theories that remain unverified. But when multiple pieces of a timeline begin to overlap in unusual ways, it naturally raises questions. And those questions are exactly what's driving this entire conversation right now. So let's rewind. Before the name Erika Kirk started trending in political and media circles, she was known in very different spaces. Pageants, public appearances, social environments that, according to some commentators, placed a strong emphasis on image, presentation, and maintaining a certain type of public persona. And this matters more than people realize. Because when someone comes from a world built on perception, branding, and controlled appearances, any unexplained gap in their timeline becomes even more noticeable. Now, according to clips that have been circulating online, Erika herself once described a period shortly after her pageant career where she chose to step away completely. She mentioned isolating, disconnecting, and removing herself from that environment for several months. 8 months, to be exact. And again, on its own, that doesn't prove anything. People take breaks. People go through personal phases. People step away from public life for reasons that are entirely private and valid. But here's where the internet starts doing what the internet does best. It starts connecting dots. Because once that 8-month gap became widely discussed, people began asking a simple question. What else was happening during that time? Not assumptions. Not accusations. Just, what else? And that's when things started getting complicated. Because when individuals online began digging through older footage, archived appearances, and timeline references, they noticed something that, at the very least, raised eyebrows. Years after that gap, in footage from a public event, Erika is seen standing with a small child nearby. Now, before anyone jumps to conclusions, there is absolutely no confirmed information about who that child is. It could be a family member, a friend's child, someone completely unrelated. But here's the detail that caught attention. The body language. People who analyzed the clip pointed out that the child appeared very comfortable around Erika. Close proximity. Familiar energy. The kind of natural interaction that, according to some viewers, felt more personal than casual. Now again, interpretation is not fact. But perception drives conversation. And once that clip started circulating, the timeline discussion intensified. Because people began asking, if that child appears to be a certain age, and if you go back to that 8-month gap, do those timelines align in a way that raises further questions? And just like that, a theory was born. Not confirmed, not proven, but definitely discussed. And in the world of viral commentary, sometimes discussion alone is enough to fuel an entire narrative. But the timeline doesn't stop there. Because alongside that footage, another detail resurfaced that added even more layers to the conversation. An old image. A medical-style snapshot. What appeared to be an ultrasound reference shown briefly in a video Erika shared herself. Now, on the surface, it looked like a normal moment, something many people share during pregnancy journeys. But online viewers, being as detail-focused as they are, noticed something specific. The name attached. According to discussions circulating across different platforms, The name visible in that image did not match the Kirk surname. Instead, it appeared to reflect her maiden name. And immediately, that sparked another wave of speculation. Because if the timeline of her marriage is publicly known, and if the name on that medical reference suggests a different time period, then when exactly was that image taken? Now again, there are many reasonable explanations. It could be an older image reused later. It could be a simple oversight. It could be completely unrelated to any of the theories being discussed. But in the world of online investigation, could be quickly turns into what if. And what if is where things start to spiral. Because now you have three separate elements being discussed simultaneously. An 8-month disappearance, a late appearance with a child, and a resurfaced image that raises timeline questions. Individually, each one is explainable. Together, they create curiosity. And curiosity, especially in today's digital environment, spreads fast. Now here's where things get even more layered. Some commentators began looking into the environments Erika was connected to during that earlier period of her life. Educational institutions, social circles, programs that, according to publicly available information, offered support for individuals going through major personal transitions. Again, nothing unusual about that. But when you place those details next to the timeline gap, the discussions become more intense. Because people start asking, was there more happening behind the scenes than what was publicly shared? And more importantly, why was that period described in such vague terms? Because if you listen carefully to how Erika herself has spoken about that time, the focus is always on emotional and personal growth. Stepping away, reflecting, resetting, which is completely valid. But what some online commentators find interesting is what isn't said. There are no detailed breakdowns of where she was, what she was doing day to day, or what specifically led to that extended period of isolation. And in a digital era where public figures often document every step of their journey, an unexplained silence stands out. Now, to be fair, privacy is a right. Not everything needs to be shared. But in the context of a growing online discussion, silence can sometimes be interpreted in ways that may not reflect reality. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because while there is no confirmed evidence supporting the more extreme theories being discussed, the lack of clear answers has allowed speculation to grow. And once speculation takes hold, it becomes very difficult to control the narrative. Which brings us to another important layer of this situation: the role of public voices. Because once larger commentators began referencing this timeline, even cautiously, the conversation moved from small online circles into a much wider audience. And with that came amplification. Clips started trending. Edits were made. Side-by-side comparisons appeared. Timelines were mapped out visually. And suddenly, what started as a simple question about an 8-month gap became something much bigger. A full-blown online investigation. Now, whether that investigation is based on accurate interpretations or misunderstood details is still unclear. But what is clear is this: people are paying attention. And the more they look, the more questions they seem to find. Because at the center of all of this isn't just a theory. It's a timeline that, at least to some observers, doesn't fully connect. And when timelines don't connect, people start trying to fill in the blanks. And when people start trying to fill in the blanks, that's when the conversation shifts from curiosity into full-blown online investigation mode. Because now it's not just about one missing timeline anymore, it's about everything surrounding it. At least, that's how many independent commentators are framing it. Again, nothing here is confirmed. Everything being discussed comes from publicly available clips, archived material, and interpretations that are still being debated. But once multiple threads begin to overlap, the narrative starts building itself. And right now, that narrative is being fueled by what some are calling pattern inconsistencies. Let's break that down. After the initial timeline gap started gaining attention, online researchers didn't stop there. They went further. They started comparing Erika's public appearances across different years, not just looking at what was shown, but also what wasn't. And that's when another talking point entered the conversation: visibility. Because according to several viewers who followed her content closely, there are very few documented moments showing her during certain key life events, especially when compared to how active she has been in other areas of her public life. Now again, that doesn't prove anything. Some people are naturally private about certain experiences. Others choose to share selectively. But in the context of everything else being discussed, it added another layer of curiosity. Because people began asking, why are some parts of the timeline highly visible, while others are almost completely absent? And that question led to even more digging, at least online. Because the next thing that started circulating wasn't just clips, It was claims, alleged accounts, anonymous comments, screenshots with no clear origin. And this is where things get tricky. Because once anonymous sources enter the picture, separating fact from speculation becomes almost impossible. Still, that didn't stop the conversation. According to posts that have been shared across various platforms, some individuals claimed that there were private discussions happening long before this topic went viral, conversations suggesting that there may have been more to Erika's earlier life than what was publicly known. Now, to be clear, these are claims, not verified reports, not confirmed statements. But in the world of online narratives, repetition alone can make something feel real. And that's exactly what started happening. Because once those claims were repeated enough times, they began to merge with the existing timeline discussions. And suddenly, the theory wasn't just about one missing period anymore. It became a broader question about transparency. What was shared versus what wasn't. And why? Now here's where the tone of the conversation begins to change. Because as more people started analyzing the situation, some took it a step further. Not just questioning the timeline, but also the public image that had been built around it. According to certain commentators, Erika's public persona has always been presented in a very structured way. Clear messaging, consistent themes, a carefully curated narrative, which, again, is not unusual. Many public figures operate this way. But when inconsistencies are perceived, even if they are not actually inconsistencies, that curated image becomes a focal point. Because people start asking, is everything we've seen the full story, or just the version that was meant to be seen? And this is where speculation starts to expand beyond just one person. Because once Erika's timeline became a topic of discussion, attention naturally shifted toward the people around her, particularly Charlie. Now again, no direct claims, no confirmed involvement in anything being discussed. But from a narrative standpoint, people began asking a different type of question. How much did he know about her life before they met? Because if the timeline gaps being discussed actually mean anything, which again, has not been proven, then it would raise broader questions about awareness. Was everything openly shared? Was it something that simply never came up? Or is this entire conversation built on misunderstandings that have been amplified online? At this stage, there are no clear answers, only theories. But the theories didn't stop there. Because once the discussion reached a wider audience, it started attracting attention from individuals who specialize in breaking down viral narratives. And that's when the conversation became even more detailed. Side-by-side timelines began appearing. Dates were cross-referenced. Clips were analyzed frame by frame. Even small details, like background environments, clothing, and location hints, were being examined for potential connections. Now, whether those connections are meaningful or coincidental is still up for debate. But what matters is this. The level of attention being placed on the situation has increased significantly. And with that attention comes amplification. Because once a topic reaches a certain level of visibility, it starts feeding itself. More people see it. More people react to it. More interpretations are added. And before long, the original question becomes something much larger. Not just what happened during those 8 months. But, is there a bigger story here that hasn't been fully explained? And that's where public reaction begins to split. On one side, you have viewers who believe the entire situation is being blown out of proportion, that the timeline gaps are normal, the interpretations are exaggerated, and the conclusions being drawn are based on incomplete information. On the other side, you have people who feel that the unanswered questions are significant, that the patterns, even if subtle, are worth paying attention to. And between those two sides, the conversation continues to grow. Now, here's something important to understand. In situations like this, perception often moves faster than reality. A single clip can create a narrative. A single detail can change how everything else is viewed. And once that narrative takes hold, it becomes very difficult to reverse. Because people aren't just watching anymore. They are analyzing. They are comparing. They are forming their own conclusions. And in many cases, those conclusions are being shared widely. Which brings us to another key factor in this entire situation. Momentum. Because at this point, the discussion isn't slowing down. If anything, it's picking up speed. More clips are being resurfaced. More commentary is being added. And more people are becoming aware of the timeline questions that started this entire conversation. Now, whether this leads to clarity or more confusion remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. The spotlight is getting brighter. And when the spotlight gets brighter, every detail starts to matter more. Which is exactly why, As this discussion continues to evolve, the focus is no longer just on what happened in the past, but on what might come next. That's where everything starts to feel different. Because once a conversation reaches this level, it's no longer just about theories floating around online. It becomes about pressure. Public pressure, narrative pressure, and the kind of attention that doesn't just fade away overnight. At least, that's how situations like this tend to unfold. And right now, according to what many observers are saying, that pressure is building. Not necessarily because of confirmed facts, but because of unanswered questions that keep resurfacing. Because here's the reality. When a story reaches this stage, people don't just want speculation anymore. They want clarity. They want explanations. And most importantly, they want consistency. Now, whether Erika addresses any of this directly or not is entirely up to her. There is no obligation for anyone to respond to online discussions, especially when those discussions are based on interpretations that may not reflect the full truth. But at the same time, public figures operate in a space where silence can sometimes create more curiosity than answers. And that's exactly the situation here. Because as more clips circulate and more timelines are discussed, people are starting to ask a different kind of question. If there's nothing to clarify, why does the conversation keep growing? Now again, that question doesn't imply guilt, wrongdoing, or any confirmed scenario. It simply reflects how audiences process information. When something feels incomplete, people try to complete it themselves. And that's where things can become complicated. Because once the audience starts building its own version of events, the original narrative can shift in ways that no one fully controls. And from what's being observed online, that shift may already be happening. Because now, the discussion isn't just limited to timelines or old clips. It's expanding into broader conversations about image, branding, and public storytelling. Some commentators have suggested that this entire situation highlights a larger issue, the gap between public identity and private reality. Again, that's a general observation, not a direct claim. But it's the kind of perspective that starts to gain traction when multiple questions remain unanswered. And once that perspective takes hold, it changes how everything is viewed moving forward. Because now, every new appearance, every statement, every post becomes part of a bigger narrative. People start analyzing tone. They start reading into phrasing. They start comparing current behavior with past timelines. And suddenly, even the smallest details begin to feel significant. Now let's talk about what this could potentially lead to. Not in terms of confirmed outcomes, but in terms of possible scenarios that are often discussed when situations like this gain momentum. One possibility is that the conversation simply fades over time. New topics emerge. Attention shifts. And what once felt like a major online investigation becomes just another moment in the cycle of viral discussions. That happens more often than people think. But there's also another possibility. The conversation continues. More information surfaces, whether it's new clips, clarifications, or additional context that changes how everything is understood. And if that happens, the narrative could evolve even further. Now, does that mean there's something hidden waiting to be revealed? Not necessarily. But it does mean that the level of attention has reached a point where any new detail, no matter how small, could have a significant impact on how the story is perceived. And perception, as we've seen, plays a huge role in situations like this. Because once an audience forms a certain impression, it can influence everything that follows. Now let's shift focus slightly. Because while most of the attention has been on Erika, there's another layer that some observers have pointed out: the broader environment surrounding the situation. Public figures, organizations, media platforms, all of them operate within a space where narratives can shape reputations very quickly. And when a narrative becomes uncertain or contested, it can create ripple effects. Not necessarily in a dramatic, headline-making way, but in subtle ways. Changes in how audiences engage. Shifts in public perception. Increased scrutiny on future actions. Again, these are general patterns that apply to many situations, not specific claims about any individual. But they are worth understanding, because they explain why conversations like this matter beyond just the initial question. Because at the center of everything isn't just a theory, it's trust. Trust in what is presented. Trust in what is understood. And trust in how narratives are built over time. Now, whether that trust is affected here is something each viewer will decide for themselves. And that's what makes this entire situation so complex. There's no single conclusion, no confirmed storyline that answers every question. Just a series of moments, details, and interpretations that have come together to create a conversation that continues to grow. And maybe that's the most important part. Not the theory itself, but the fact that people are paying attention. They are asking questions. They are looking deeper. And they are trying to understand something that, at least right now, doesn't have a clear explanation. So where does that leave us? Right back where we started. With that 8-month gap. With the footage that raised eyebrows. With the details that may or may not connect. And with a conversation that shows no signs of slowing down. Because whether this turns out to be something significant, or simply a case of timelines being interpreted in different ways, one thing is certain. The questions aren't going away anytime soon. And until they do, people will keep watching. They'll keep analyzing. And they'll keep asking the same question that started it all. What really happened during those 8 months? And why does it still feel like there's more to the story? And now I want to hear from you. After everything we just broke down, the timeline gaps, the resurfaced clips, the questions people online keep asking, what do you actually think is going on here? Is this just the internet doing what it always does, taking small details and turning them into something bigger than they really are? Or do you think there are still pieces of this story that haven't been fully explained yet? Because one thing is clear, the conversation isn't slowing down. And the more people look into it, the more perspectives keep coming out. So drop your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious to see where you stand on this. And if you made it this far, make sure you hit that like button, not just to support the video, but to help more people see this discussion and share their take as well. Subscribe if you want more breakdowns like this, where we'll look at viral stories, online theories, and the details people often overlook. And turn on notifications, because if anything new surfaces around this topic, you already know we're going to be right here, breaking it all down. Stay sharp, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.